Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 school shooting database. And a couple months ago, I got an email asking for the raw data and asking for some information. And I get a lot of these requests. A lot of people, I provide information. I never really hear back. But about 2 weeks ago, I got an email in my inbox, and it was from Dr. Jason Koele. And he said, "Here's my dissertation. It's done and attached." So this is now Dr. Jason Koele. He's a school principal in Missouri. He is now a doctor of education from Southwest Baptist University. And based on his dissertation, I wanted to have him on the show today because the dissertation is differences between Missouri K-12 educator perceptions of safety on campus. The teachers are allowed to carry concealed weapons compared to those that are not. This is a hot topic, and Dr. Jason Koele is the guy to talk about it. So thank you for joining the show.
I'm very humbled to be here. I appreciate you having me on and providing the data to help enforce my research, but also just, reaching back out and asking if I'd talk a little bit about it.
For sure. So before we get into your dissertation and the research, which is in a completely new area where there's really not a lot of peer-reviewed studies around school security or different procedures, you're a school principal. How did you get into education? What has your path been as an educator?
It's actually pretty unique. I am a native of Wisconsin. I grew up in a small town on the west central side, a town called Prescott. It's where the Mississippi and St. Croix rivers come together. And I fell in love with music, and I ended up going to college to be a music educator at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, where I spent 5 years studying that along with youth and family ministry. And I ended up going back across the river and getting a job as a high school band director at a school named St. Croix Central, again, West Central Wisconsin, where I was able to serve in that capacity for 6 years as actually a head baseball coach and band director, which is a unique circumstance. And then I pivoted into administration, from there being the assistant principal and athletics director. And when I got into that role, any young administrator that listens to your podcast, a lot of teachers don't realize how much administrators talk about school safety, keeping people safe, whether it's in building, active threat situations, hazardous materials, weather-related stuff, and then being an athletic director, talking about threat situations or emergency situations outside of the building during school events, football games, basketball events, what do you do in those circumstances? So as a teacher, I didn't really know much about school safety until I'd go through the drills. I'd go through all the trainings, but I didn't know the capacity of which administrators dive into that topic. So in my role there for 3 years as an administrator, I got to meet some school safety experts and kind of dive into threat assessment protocols. And then my wife is a St. Louis native, and she got tired of the cold. I'll be honest. She was done with the snow and wanted to get closer to her family. So I decided to look for jobs in Missouri. And the Lord led me to where I'm at right now. It's a very small school district, I would say in the middle of nowhere on a major highway, where the police response is at least 20 minutes. So we rely on highway patrol. There's no town around our school. It is pastures, cow pastures. And it's 4 small towns that make up our district. It's 40 minutes tall by 40 minutes wide. So it's very rural. What I did not know was the differences between Wisconsin's public education structure and school safety and Missouri's. So when the states politically are fairly different. Wisconsin was conservative for a while and now leans more with Democrat policies. and Missouri is very conservative. So when I took this job, what I didn't know is the school does have what's called an SPO program, or School Protection Officer program. In 2014, Missouri passed legislation to allow teacher concealed carry. And in my school district, we do have educators that carry concealed weapons. And I was fascinated by that. One, because I hadn't heard of it before, like at all, that schools in the country allow teachers to conceal carry. I had heard of school resource officers or law enforcement officials on campuses, but not ever teachers carrying in the classroom or in the halls. So this was a fairly radical idea for me. I did go through the School Protection Officer program, and which is a 120-hour course that's trained that you're trained by actual law enforcement officials, and you do your qualifying with. I did some of my qualifying with Springfield law enforcement officials, some FBI guys that needed to requalify for shooting. The training was extensive, and disclosure, I do carry at school. Some of it is
it's a very unique environment, because I think that school safety is often lumped into one image of a school.
Absolutely.
And that's often a large suburban, well-resourced school where not only does that school have staff, have budgets, have capabilities, have emergency response resources close by, but it's also a campus where it has defined boundaries. It has fences, it has parking lots, it has student areas and buildings. But when you look at the characteristics of campuses across the country, there are urban campuses where the doors open directly to the street. There are urban campuses where a school is the first couple floors of a high-rise building. And then flipping to the opposite direction where you are, there are schools that are extremely isolated. Yeah, there are schools where, you might only have one ambulance in that jurisdiction. I think back to the hostage crisis in Cokeville, Wyoming in 1986. And that was an extremely isolated school where more than 100 kids were taken hostage. And when firebombs went off and during a shootout, there were 70 kids severely injured in an area where, you're an hour from the closest trauma center.
Pretty much.
So I mean, what's it like being in that rural school and knowing that so much of what would potentially happen during any emergency is going to be the responsibility of the school staff? It's
challenging. You had Dr. Trump on a couple episodes ago, and I encourage your listeners to listen to him and that recording. But he said, when you visit one school, you visited one school. And, I now work for another school safety company called Strategos International, which does active threat training for bus drivers in schools. So I've visited a lot of schools, and you're absolutely right. Every school has its own culture, its own identity, and its own physical structures, how it's made up, its own mindset, and it's driven by the community in which it resides. There's schools in suburban areas that are very close together, but their communities are totally different. The design of the school, some schools are built of glass now, which now they have to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars on ballistic film and whatever. Some schools look like prisons. It just, every school is so different. And in my circumstance at where I'm employed, it challenges our staff to increase our training. And what I would say is I think people limit educators a little bit, that they're only professionals in academics. But educators are educators and they learn. So there's really not a limit to anybody's capacity to learn new skills or learn fundamentals to do certain things. In our situation, we have several staff that are trained in, preventative measures for threat situations. I've been trained in hand ground combat. You know what I mean? Because when you're alone and you don't have the financial resources or the infrastructure around you, you have to take care of your own. So we have to keep our kids safe. And we're in a position to do whatever is necessary to keep the kids in our community safe. When parents drop them off, or they get here on the bus, or they get on the bus, they're expecting schools to provide that safety for their child. And they're giving that permission to do so when they allow them the en partis. We are the
school's unique in that it's the only institution in the entire country, really, where a parent is giving their child to the custody of the state.
Yes.
That an agent of the state is responsible for their well-being, for giving them their medications, for transporting them, for, calling for EMS if there's an emergency, any of these things. And with that responsibility comes that you need to keep your promise of delivering that child back to the parent at the end of the day. And unfortunately, my expectation is that there should be a zero failure system. Should never have a situation where a potentially preventable action resulted in a kid, not making it home.
Right.
So, yeah. And unfortunately, so much of the responsibility of that ends up falling on educators. Before we get into your dissertation, I do have one logistical question. It's kind of specific to Missouri, because as I've seen different schools implement armed teacher programs or armed staff or contract security that's been mandated in some states, what I haven't seen is a use of force continuum. And my graduate education is in criminal justice and criminology, and kind of the institutions. And part of that is the policies that drive them. And in police departments at every level across the country, there is a legally kind of binding document which outlines, based on different situations, what it is acceptable for a police officer to do. That if somebody is disobeying your commands, you can grab them. If somebody's moving towards you aggressively, that you can hit them with a baton or pepper spray them. And it moves all the way up this continuum, this use of force continuum, to the point that when that officer is in fear of their life, then they can resort to using a firearm. With a teacher, where you don't have an equipment belt with handcuffs and batons and tasers and pepper spray, their kids are huge these days. I feel old saying that, but I mean, there are middle school kids that tower over adults. How does a teacher balance when it is appropriate to use deadly force against very likely a student in that school setting, when you don't have all of those other pieces of the continuum that a police officer might have?
And it's a really good question, because these teacher concealed carry program requirements are all over the board. Every state seems to be different in their qualifications. So speaking to Missouri specifically, the 120-hour, 3-week course it parallels law enforcement protocols. So when they train us or teachers that carry in that sequence, it follows the same as law enforcement standards. In a situation, so I would say if you're doing a specific situation of let's say a large student is beating another student, and you see this a lot now, or even with a student beating a teacher. It's, again, that decision-making protocol of, is this person's life at risk, and what mechanisms do I use to deter them from killing that individual? So if they become a victim, what means do you have to use? So there's other things like you can use other objects to get a student off, as simple as your cell phone. If when somebody's in that mindset of hurting somebody, any type of way to get them out of that loop is going to help deter or distract, and maybe create an opportunity for intervention that isn't use of deadly force. But if a teacher that carries, I guess, makes the decision that this student or individual is going to punch or harm or beat this person to the point of death, it's the duty of that educator to step in, just like a law enforcement official, to stop the threat, to save that person's life because they don't have the ability to do so. So our training is very similar to law enforcement, and I think that's how it should be. If teachers are going to carry, I think it should follow the same structures that law enforcement officials are held to. But I don't, I think people struggle with the programs and certifications of how that looks. Like, it can't be just as simple as passing a concealed carry permit test. Like, that's not
no, it's something good. That, also beyond the police side of training, I think that for educators who, people like yourself, you're a deeply caring person in that you're interested in spirituality and music and athletics and doing all of these things that kind of nurture this school community, that beyond the training, there's also really ethical questions that educators need to talk about.
Very much so.
With what they would do before they're in a situation when they pull the trigger. I think that that's really important for a school district, to have structured spaces for armed faculty to think about what they're going to do, what are the consequences in different situations. I think back to the teacher at Rich Neck Elementary School in Richmond, where, she sees a 6-year-old student pull a gun out in the classroom.
Yeah.
In that moment, she doesn't know if that student's going to shoot other students, shoot her, what's going to happen. Within that second, that teacher needs to decide, am I going to shoot at a 6-year-old today? And that's a very uncomfortable question, but that's something that every educator needs to make a decision about long before they're in that circumstance. And the only way that you can do that is through having those discussions in a productive way with other people that are going to be in that situation.
And you're absolutely right. And that's a major ethical dilemma that even officers have to go through. That it's no different than a law enforcement official that has to decide, am I willing to take somebody's life? And when you're in an educational setting and you choose to carry a weapon as a teacher, you're already conditioned to care for and love kids, right? So if you're in a position, it's like, again, going back to the parent. I am the parent for these kids, and if you think of it from a parent perspective, if somebody comes to your house and points a gun at your kid, what are you going to do? Would you shoot that person? You're going to take the measures necessary to protect your kid, right? So for me, psychologically, these are questions that I ask myself all the time. Emergency professionals talk about tabletops and running scenarios and situations. You can't prepare for all of them, but you can condition your mind. You have to allow your mind. This is something I learned through Strategos International, is, you have to, your body can't go where your mind hasn't been. So if you're going to take on the responsibility of carrying a weapon in school, whether an SRO, teacher, whatever, you have to be okay letting your mind go there to what limit you're going to protect the kids in your room.
Yeah, and the unfortunate reality, which, when I started the school shooting database 6 years ago, I didn't know what the characteristics of school shootings were. Yeah. I didn't think about this broader landscape of gun violence on school campuses. But once you look at thousands of incidents, the really uncomfortable reality is that it's most frequently a current student or a recently former student at the school.
Yeah.
And it's usually between kids that are 12 to 17 are the most common. So it's not an educator who is going to have an opportunity to, in most cases, kill this deranged outsider. It's an educator who's going to be putting somebody they know and probably taught and probably cared for
absolutely
into the sights, and that's a tough situation.
It is. It's so tough to go through, but you have to have the decision already in your head that if somebody's coming to harm, I'm responsible for the other kids too. Mm-hmm. And if I have to make a decision of, of shooting a former student because they're trying to kill tens, hundreds. Like in their mindset, they've crossed into they're not my student anymore. They've crossed into a whole different realm to hurt human life. And to me, again, my kids go to my school like my own children. What would I do as a parent?
Yeah.
Whether I know that person or not, I'm not going to let my kids get hurt. And I think every educator shares that. Not necessarily to the extent of shooting another kid, but that they have a protective nature. They want their nurturers. They want to care for and protect their kids at all costs.
Teaching is one of probably the most difficult and undervalued professions in the United States.
It's hard. That's why parents like to send their kids back to school after the summer.
Yeah, and it shows the incredible commitment that teachers and educators have, that with lack of resources, with pay that's way below where it should be, with all of the different pressures that they face externally and internally in the classroom, that teachers continue to show up and give everything that they have for their students, every single year. So obviously you wanted to continue advancing your career. You decided to get the doctorate of education from Southwest Baptist. Tell me about, what went into your decision to pursue your doctorate? What kind of research interests you, and ultimately how you got into this study of concealed carry and staff's perceptions?
So I've always been a learner. I like to challenge myself, and I'd say most educators do. But I don't know, getting your doctorate's a whole nother level of I like to learn.
I've failed at it twice so far, but
I like to punish myself.
The charm.
I like to punish myself, I guess, because it's a totally different journey than let's say your master's degree or specialist. It's very personal, and it's challenging in more ways than just writing. It's not just that you got to write a whole bunch of stuff, but you get to deep dive into other people's research. You get to deep dive into a topic that you can hopefully make a difference. I know not many people read dissertations. It's not like a light reading type thing, but you try to fill in on just even one pothole on the road that can add to something maybe much greater. So like as far as my career, I was a high school principal. So when I moved to Missouri, I became a high school principal. I was in that role for 3 years. And it's, the expectancy rate of a principal administrator now is 3 to 5 years in their role. There's a lot of burnout. And I didn't necessarily burn out of that position, but I knew I wanted to continue learning. And I wanted to get my doctorate done before my kids got older and more involved. In Missouri, most school administrators that work in larger districts, it's a requirement. So that if you want to be a high school principal or a principal in a large district or a superintendent, most schools prefer a part of the continuing ed of teachers that you get your doctorate degree. So I knew I was going to have to anyway at some point. So I figured might as well be now. Southwest Baptist University is not too far from where I work and live. So it kind of matched my value set and kind of what education I wanted to get. And it was an all-encompassing program. It was a fantastic program. So it interwove the writing component with the classes. So every class we took, it integrated and helped us synthesize our paper along the way. So it was meaningful. And some programs aren't like that, but this one was great. So when you try to find a topic, I didn't realize how difficult it is to find a topic because it's either too broad or it's been studied or so there's a sweet spot, and it takes a long time, months, to figure out what that sweet spot is.
Years.
Sometimes years.
Or decades in some cases.
Yeah. And so for me, I had again, moving to Missouri, just it changed. It was a different perspective, right? And I was in an environment that was new in teacher concealed carry. And I was like, well, hey, what has been researched in this topic? And when I dug in, there's not a whole lot, David. I mean, for such a prolific topic in our country right now, as far as school safety, And it has been since Columbine, right? When everything gets elevated, and that's the gold standard of whatever's the media and everybody points back to. And each situation we go back to, it'll never happen again. And then we get all the way, we go track, which you've tracked and did a great job. And again, I've used a lot of your research in my research. Then you have Uvalde, and you have all these things, and we keep saying it, never again, never again, never again. When I expected there to be a lot. I expected there to be a lot of peer-reviewed research in this topic, even in school safety or perspectives of teachers, law enforcement officials, in general. But there's very little. It was almost to the point where I couldn't continue with my topic because there wasn't enough peer-reviewed research within the last 5 years to do anything with. And you think of, and you see it on your K-12 active shooter database, the amount of violence that has occurred in schools post-COVID has been substantial. I mean, like 100% increase, 200% increase in whether assaults or acts of violence, bringing weapons on campuses.
Habitual gun carrying. That's one of the most interesting things that I found, because I set out to study planned attacks. But every time that I was seeing Google alerts, it was about fights that are escalating into shootings. Yeah. And that's an entirely different characteristic of gun violence on campus. It requires different interventions, different planning, different response. But the thought that some kids are going to be in a fight in the hallway between second period, and that might turn into 5 bystanders, wounded in your school. It's an incredibly different situation and threat than people have really been preparing for.
And I would say that's huge, because when you talk about boots on the ground in schools, you see this throughout history, right? We have an incident, and then we wait for law enforcement officials to create a scenario for schools in a protocol and an emergency action plan and steps and whatever. And it's happened so rapidly in the last 3 to 4 years. We're so far behind in resources that the protocols that we have in place don't match the need. And so schools, and Dr. Trump was right, it's a mess as far as response procedures when it comes to, kids assaulting teachers, kids just assaulting other kids out of nowhere, like mental health issues. It's overwhelming, and it's flooding the system, and we don't have a good response because we're not getting there's not enough dialogue like you're creating between law enforcement and educators to create a solution. So again, that's where
parents and community members. Yeah. If all the responsibility falls on the school, then every other piece where there's a shortfall or something that's broken in the chain that would lead to a kid bringing a gun to school, the school, when somebody has a gun on campus, it's already too late in so many ways. So, we put this incredible burden on educators to solve a lot of issues that are exterior to the school. And I think, another thing I didn't realize in this is your school is a microcosm of your entire community, especially in a small community. It's your gathering place. It's community functions. It might be church groups or volunteer groups that use the school. It might be the only gym that people are playing basketball at in the evenings or afternoons or weekends. The entire community is there for football games. So every issue that you're having in that community is going to be brought onto the campus.
Correct.
And then it all falls on the shoulders of a school administrator to try to solve every one of those problems that might pop up on campus.
Social issues, community issues, it does. It spills over. And I think that's one of the issues that, in my opinion, that the U.S. has right now, is the schools become the catch-all. It is the clinic. It is the social worker. It is the therapist. It is the family counselor. It is the feeding mechanism. We got to feed everybody. It's become the
without giving the school the resources it needs Correct. To do all of those things.
When it's stretched so thin, again, your emergency action plan and your mitigation strategies you have to train even harder and learn more things about how to respond to every single scenario, which there's more than you can fathom when you start getting, even in larger communities. And I think that's the fallacy people have is, these schools that, like you said, it's the suburban school that's well funded, that's got all these things that can just, just install the ballistic film and can do all these, hire the SR, like do all these things. Schools like mine, which there are many schools very similar to mine. They don't have the resources. There are
98,000 public schools in the country. More than half of them are rural schools with under 1,000 students.
And when states do their funding formulas, and it's based on assessed valuation in school, my county is one of the top 3 poorest counties in Missouri. We don't get the luxury to spend money in certain things. So, like, again, I point back to Dr. Trump. He talked about grants, living off of grants and living off of the federal opportunities, the school violence grant. Like, those are the things that we apply for constantly at the state and federal level just to get some sort of resources, to mitigate. So some schools have to implement programs like Teacher Conceal and Carry because they are the law enforcement of the community. Like, they take on that role too. So that really drove my interest in this topic and how do public teachers feel about that? What is their perception of safety in schools that allow teachers to carry or just administrators to carry versus those that don't have any policy at all because they perceive that their school is just fine the way it is. So that kind of was the driving force in what I was looking at.
So could you lay out for me your research question, where and how you found the data to answer it, and then just the high level findings from your dissertation?
Yeah, so I looked at 3 different questions specifically. I looked at educators' perception of safety in general. So their general perception of safety, that included like the environment, the kids, they themselves, it could be school protocols. And I compared the difference between schools that have a policy and those that do not. So they have a teacher conceal carry policy versus those that do not. That was question number 1. Question number 2 dove into their individual perception. So how do I feel as an educator in an environment that has a concealed carry policy versus those that don't? And then the last one, the third question I looked at was, how do teachers perceive a policy? So if a policy is in place, if administrators only carry versus educators. So I lump teachers and administrators together into educators. So administrators only versus educators. So a bigger pool of people that could carry. So then I compared the responses of those with a policy versus those without. And it was really interesting. I did not, there were some things that I expected and there were some things that I didn't. Prior research, or the limited research that I found, in the last 5 years, there's been an overwhelming lack of support for teacher concealed carry policies. Upwards of 75% or greater. And this was in national studies and a few that were done kind of localized, but none of them had statistical significance, I would say. So there wasn't a survey or instrument that I could use that was well put together towards this topic specifically. The only one I could find was by Dr. Wood and Dr. Hampton. And they did 2 studies, one in 2021 and 2022. I reached out to them, and Dr. Hampton has passed, but Dr. Wood allowed me to continue on with my research or use his survey. So I asked permission to modify his survey to meet the needs of my dissertation topic, and he granted that permission. So I was able to move forward. So I had to basically construct a survey by myself, and then do what's called the principal component analysis to validate the instrument that I was using to make sure that the questions weren't abnormal or threw people off, that it had actual statistical significance for and was verifiable. So I used two schools in Missouri that were very similar in size and demographic, one with a policy, one without, and I completed my pilot survey. And I had to remove a few questions. And then I was able to send it out before the end of this last school year to educators across the state. So I sent it to 429 superintendents, and I had 29 school districts respond back to me that took this survey. The survey had Likert scale questions. There were a couple sections of Likert scale questions. There were 13 of them total. Those went into the statistical analysis that I could use to run statistical t-test, independent samples t-test with those. And then I had some demographic questions that were more just general. And the statistics I got, there was an interesting factor that came out of the demographic questions that I'll highlight in a minute. But basically, the results of the survey, there was a high. I didn't get a lot of urban and suburban school districts to respond. A lot of it is because they have different protocols. So to do research studies in large schools, you got to go through an application process, and then you got to have their school board review it, and then you got to go through usually an assistant superintendent to like disperse it amongst the staff. So it's a lengthy process, and I didn't really want to deal with that, to be honest. So I did have a few schools that didn't have those processes, but I had about 90% of the schools that responded were rural. Which is interesting because a lot of rural schools implement these policies in Missouri. So another demographic area that I really wanted to get more of was people of different ethnicities. I would say 90% of the respondents I got were white public educators. But I'm in Missouri, and rural schools typically there's a lot of white Caucasian ethnicities in rural Missouri. So I wasn't necessarily surprised by that, but I would have liked to get a broader demographic. So that makes a difference in the perception of their safety, where the location of the school is at. And other studies supported that. But when I ran all the statistics on the 13 questions, answering question number one, their perception of general safety, I got statistical significance with that. And what that means is basically it's verifiable. It's legit statistics. There was a difference between those with a policy and those without. Those without a policy felt safer than those with a policy. Those with a policy in the spectrum of safety, there's a mean score. Those with a policy actually felt pretty neutral. They didn't feel safe, and they didn't feel unsafe. Those that don't have a policy perceive those questions, which had to do with firearms in school, as unsafe. So meaning if there was a policy, they'd feel unsafe there. But again, their perception is coming from they don't have a policy in their school and they don't want one. So they perceive that their schools are safer. The second question, I was actually very surprised at. I did not get statistical significance from the individual response. So my perception as an individual. And why I was surprised by that is because conceal and carry is a personal choice. So in states that allow conceal and carry, their perception of safety is impacted solely on themselves. So when they thought of themselves, did they think that I would be safer if maybe I could carry? If a policy allowed me to carry, would I feel safer if I had a gun? Or if others were to carry, I'd feel safer. So I didn't get any. It was pretty neutral. There was no data that suggested either way if one felt safer than the other. It was actually fairly close to neutral on both fronts. So I was more surprised by that because people are motivated by the self. We're human, so our perspective comes from ourselves. So I thought that would impact the research more.
But that's the exciting thing about research is you have these hypotheses, and then once you see your actual data, things can be completely different. And then that
Completely.
takes you down a completely different path of trying to explain why. Like, you probably weren't thinking about individual psychological factors of self at the
Yeah.
time, but all of a sudden you've opened up a whole nother line of inquiry.
Yeah. And dissertations, for those of your listeners that don't know about, educational research, you have to have a theoretical framework. So there's got to be proven theories that you base your paper off of. And I use Rogers' protective motivation theory as one of my main theoretical frameworks. So it's based off of, if I perceive a threat, what limit am I willing to go to protect myself? So my perception of the threat leads to action or inaction. So that's what I base my entire paper off of. The third question, again, was unique because it was about, if a policy was in place, would you feel safer if administrators only carried, or educators, so more people, so that the pool was bigger. And I did get, there were some outliers and different things in the stats, but I pushed through those, with my doctoral chair. The independent samples t-test is a very robust analysis, so it can handle some different quirks in the study. So this question I had to take with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it was still statistically significant that people preferred only administrators to carry, or a smaller pool of people carrying, if a policy were in place, and that was significant. So a lot of that stuff, again, supported prior research, the limited prior research that there was, that educators still preferred not to have teachers conceal and carry, and if so, that they limit it to specific individuals, that it's not large in capacity if you have to implement a strategy. But again, I'll circle back to the demographic questions. This is where it was very unique. In the demographic questions, I asked a kind of a motivated question. So I asked a question: if a teacher were paid more or extrinsically motivated to carry, would they consider it? And there were actually a significant amount of people that responded that they would. So I had some, in a demographic question, again, that's not statistically significant or backed up by any analysis, but I had a contradiction. I had individuals that were responding to the survey that they didn't support teacher conceal and carry, that were willing to carry if they were paid a stipend or a financial gain.
Sadly, that may speak to how poorly compensated so many educators are.
It could.
And I mean, yes. that just any extra dollars that you can provide, might have an enormous benefit to an educator's
and you're not wrong.
Family and lifestyle.
You're not wrong. And I would say a lot of the stipends that, we've done some assessment of what stipends are for teachers that do carry. And it's very little. I mean, you're risking your life and doing what a law enforcement, and cops don't get paid very much either. I mean, so it's comparable. Like, stipend's not like outrageous or anything when you're risking your life to save other people. But I thought that was very interesting because it kind of contradicted the Wood & Hampton survey before also, where they answered those exact same questions, and 75% of respondents said they would not. So in my study, 47% said they would not. So, I mean, over 50% of people said they would be willing to carry if they were compensated for it.
Yeah, a great behavioral economics paper
Yes.
that we could write after this is, if you had multiple groups and you gave one a large stipend to carry, and you had another group where, say, you gave a significantly larger stipend not to carry, even if they had the option to do so, we could test out. Behavioral economics is one of my favorite topics to think about. I wish that I had studied that
it is
years ago, but we all get to where we are. So, kind of in our last couple minutes here, for educators at rural schools, for school superintendents, for, even though every single school is different, the common thread is every superintendent, every principal is looking for answers, is looking for some way to navigate this landscape of just really impossible decisions in under-resourced situations. From your study, what would you recommend to somebody that's evaluating a concealed carry protocol for their staff?
Going back to, again, it's not Dr. Trump's quote, but every school. Like what you've seen one school, you've seen one school. My recommendation, even from my research, is every school needs to really have a conversation with their community. And it goes back to what you were saying. If the school is going to be the center, and it has been for a long time, schools are the center of communities. They house the most valuable resource on the planet, our kids. If we're going to make decisions, we need to make sure that we have the input of our community members and their support to implement any policy, really, especially when you're talking about individuals carrying firearms and what that looks like, whether it's looking at a school resource officer full time and how to fund it. Like if it's a need for the community, it should be highly, funded. We should fund it, but it's got to be. They need to have conversations. School boards need to have conversations with their administrators and school safety experts and looking at, research like you're doing in area statistics on violence and, the risk scenarios of what their community holds, because every community is different. Every school district is comprised of different people, different demographics, and different issues. But a lot of issues are the same. And again, in my demographic questions, there's standard things that schools do that in my research aren't being implemented with fidelity across all schools. And they're simple things. Like you mentioned the elementary teacher and the sixth grader, pulling out a gun. Those backpacks can be searched ahead of time if there's a potential for a threat and you know it ahead of time. There's simple things that schools aren't doing to mitigate that have been in place for a long time. But also to the other extreme of putting in these multi-million-dollar systems that blow, hot steam and quadrants and flashing lights and whatever. I guess schools are looking for what is the best solution in standard protocols in the new, I would say, post-COVID era, because school violence is totally different now than it was before then, and active threats continue to evolve. What are law enforcement individuals training for now? Like, why is it? There needs to be more communication. And as we see, and you mentioned this on your podcast, even at the federal level, with the political climate we have now, there's communication failures.
Yeah, there's no top-down leadership in school safety, and just looking at that, pieces of it come from Department of Education, other pieces come from Secret Service, other things come from the FBI, other things come from Department of Justice. We don't have any crime statistics nationally that are specific to schools. School campus isn't even one of the criteria for collecting, your Nevers data. But I think my last question for you, because you never know who listens to these podcasts, where these things could go.
Yeah.
You're a school principal in rural Missouri. If you could have an audience directly with the Secretary of Education, at the Federal Department of Education, what do you need right now as a school administrator that would make your life easier and make your students safer?
I would say less red tape. And I think a lot of educators would say that from the federal level to the state level, and anybody that's in a industry where there's a lot of red tape, it makes things a lot harder. You can't get as many resources when you need them. I would say we got to cut out some of the red tape or some of the specific language that hinders schools from gaining access to grants or programs that help them do what they need to do to keep their kids safe. The SVVP or the SVPP grant changed the language. When you change language, it gets harder for people to access things. So number one, create more accessibility. And number two, I would say get out and see schools. Like, as superintendents or principals, sometimes we get stuck in our offices and you lose touch with what's happening in the classroom. And I know every administrator probably says, I get into every classroom and I know exactly what's going on, but that's not the truth. And I would say leaders in our governmental systems lose touch with what's happening in their communities, especially at the federal level that provide a lot of this funding. They forget what's happening in schools like mine. They forget what's happening in rural America because it's all dictated by politics. But regardless of politics, we have, again, the most incredible, invaluable resource of kids that should transcend all political spectrums. And we should provide resources and the needs to make sure that kids have what they need, whether it's mental health resources, security resources. They're not communicating with us. They're not stopping in and seeing what it's like. I would recommend that they do that more.
Well, I hope somebody out there is listening. I'm going to put your contact information in the show notes, as well as a link to your dissertation. Not your phone number. Don't worry. It'll just be your LinkedIn there. But it's been a pleasure today. This was another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. The guest today was Dr. Jason Koele. He's a principal in rural Missouri. He is a doctor of education from Southwest Baptist University, and he's really trying to do something both at the school level and the policy level and the research level to add information, to add empirical evidence to really important topics. And if we're not doing that, we're just guessing. And guesses are going to lead to bad outcomes. So, Jason, thank you so much.
Thanks, David.